Hey, look at us doing a little preview of this episode. This episode of Unbuffered looks at it's kind of a new technology, but it's reignited an ancient debate, which is the tension between perceived security and privacy. This technology is newish and it's centered around ubiquitous internet access. That's why one of the reasons we're talking about it, but also massive databases. The debate is timeless, though. Technology is new. The debate is old. And in this discussion, we range all over while talking about it. We cover some areas that are hotly debated. And as usual, we don't pull any punches. I just wanted to note that we aren't observers in this. We are participants, all of us, in deciding whether technology will liberate us or imprison us. Or more accurately, to what extent it's going to do both. Hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to Unbuffered, the Unbuffered podcast. I'm Chris Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and today I'm speaking with Daniel Boguslaw, who is an independent reporter. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, we're doing a show today that I don't know. There's so many different ways to title it, but I was thinking "Flock Off," given the way some of the cities are responding to their contracts with Flock or proposed contracts with Flock. Flock seems like a big deal. I only learned about it earlier this year while I was riding around with a friend and a guy who works with us on our tribal broadband boot camps, and we were driving through Southern California, and he's like, "Flock," and I was like, "What the flock are you talking about?" And he explained it to me, and I was surprised. I was so uninformed. But for people who haven't picked up on it in the news, what is Flock?
Yeah, so Flock is I guess it kind of depends on who you ask. I think if you ask the company, they'll say that it's a quasi-automated law enforcement and also private community license plate reader and surveillance camera. It's interesting insofar as it seems to be it's also a service, right? And that's, I think, maybe one of the key things that kind of differentiates it is, you're not just selling the physical whatever CCTV camera, security camera. You're also kind of selling this entire system for tracking individuals' cars, tracking the scratch on the car in addition to the license plate, the color, and then the entire sort of database and data infrastructure and storage as well. And so that's sort of like the most basic interpretation, I guess you can say, of what they're doing. I think there's been a lot of reporting showing that they have all these other bells and whistles, or maybe bells and whistles is minimizing them, but there's the potential for all kinds of increased surveillance technology in the basic camera box, in the basic hardware. So there was also potentially voice recognition products. There's potential AI facial recognition products that were going to get rolled out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of the way that this was initially sold or was pitched was like, this is basically just like when you go through a toll booth, right? And it snaps a picture of your camera, like that's all that this is. And then if there's a crime in the area, we go search it. But really what we're talking about is a huge quantity of data, basically anyone who's going past it. So this is not activated if you are speeding, right? This is bulk collection, and basically then creating a database to go hunting for anyone,
Ex-girlfriends.
Well, right. Anyone who causes an infraction, but then anyone that these officers want to track, and so that's one of the big, most high-profile critiques that have emerged. There've been over a dozen, I think well over a dozen, I think dozens of instances of law enforcement officers, using these tools to go after domestic partners, to surveil their kids, all kinds of things. But my feeling is like, even without that, we're creating a sort of panopticon database of human movement.
Hmm.
There's also been concerns, I think, of someone going across state lines to buy, a small personal use amount of, marijuana, and then, basically being tracked across the border and back, and then prosecuted. So, but at the same time, like, variations of this technology have existed for a while. And so what's really interesting about the national conversation is the fact that people are realizing they have a civic tool to attack this technology, and they don't like it. And, I'll just say off the top, we can get into more why, but I think that, like, this is, like I said, there's other versions of this. There's other companies who are having, who are taking the place of Flock sometimes when people are successful using their city councils to remove it. But the point is that, like, people have seized on a way to exercise their civic muscle by having their city
Hmm.
councils ban this technology in their municipalities. And to me, that's anytime we see grassroots uh, organizations, or even just non-organizations, just random people in the community come together and say, like, we are going to exercise political control instead of a corporation, or instead of a rubber stamped city council. I think that's really interesting, and is oftentimes a symbol of something bigger that's going on, right? Like, the pundit class, the reporter class in DC and New York have spent a lot of time, whether it's flock safety cameras or whether it's data centers, complaining basically about how the Hicks and Rubes in the heartland don't really understand these technologies. They don't really understand the cost benefit analysis, and they should sit down and shut up and let their corporate masters and pundits, pontificate to them about how to, create mass surveillance safely or create data centers safely. And the
Hmm.
reality is that, people are channeling, I think, a greater frustration with a technology that has largely been ungoverned, or at least ungovernable by them, and they are attempting, and successfully attempting, to regulate it in the ways that they can. So that's my huge bird's eye view of kind of what Flock is, and why I think we're having this conversation, why people nationally are having this conversation. And as you can tell, I'm very hostile towards this idea of criticizing our civic process and our American democracy, which is supposed to function.
Yeah. So this is what we're going to talk about, and we're going to be, I think, taking in a lot of different angles of this. But I did want to, before we get too deep into it, I did want to ask you and tell you. I think, you and I haven't talked before, except for one aborted attempt in which we learned that not all of Europe has amazing internet access, like
Yes.
some people say. There are
Yes.
a lot of gaps in apartments, it turns out. But when I was speaking with friends of mine that are working diligently with, I mean, a right and left coalition on surveillance issues and the powers of the United States government in particular, I said, "Who should I talk to about Flock?" And they said, "You." And so I'm just curious, why did they say that?
Yeah, I mean, so um, I've been very interested in this new frontier. I mean, I think, I used to work at The Intercept, which the founding premise was really about domestic and foreign surveillance, based on the revelations that came out with the terabytes of data or whatever that Edward Snowden released. Um, but then everything just kind of faded into the background, and everyone kind of came to accept that, like, we have this, whether it's ad tech or whether it's the US government. I mean, the irony of that is that, like, um just to show how far things have sunk, is the fact that, like, when I talk to people in the intelligence community, when I talk to people in national security world, they're like, who even cares about what the NSA is collecting? It's all bulk now. It's all corporate. Like, they can go and just buy this stuff direct from the company. And why even go through the hoops of tapping into the undersea cables and all this stuff when it's getting sold for pennies on the dollar? So I've become, I'm going to answer your question, I promise. But, for that same reason, I've become very interested in the intersection between corporations and domestic surveillance. And, you can make the argument that, a lot of this cutting edge collection was happening from state actors or the U.S. intelligence community. Now it is, can you hear that on your end? Someone is
I'm
honking
not picking it
furiously.
up.
Okay, great. Okay, then I'm just going to ignore it. Maybe it's someone collecting on my end. Who knows? But really, corporations have taken the center of domestic surveillance and domestic data collection, and so I've been very interested anytime there's a story about corporations getting involved in this, and I think it tends to reinforce. So if there's one node that has anything to do with national security or anything to do with this so-called critical infrastructure designation, which is swelled to encompass basically everything, every part of our industrialized society, then the companies that are touching it are going to be developing their own data processing surveillance apparatus, and they don't view it as Big Brother. They view it as this is what doing business in the 21st century looks like. But that's why I think it's really critical to drill down into these things and say, like, okay, but what does this actually look like? This isn't just a traffic camera. This is actually mutated into something much crazier.
Right. I have to jump in because, like, we live in these wild times in which you're talking about the essential infrastructure, this being stretched and stretched, right? We're going to try and protect more and more things, we're told. At the same time, the best evidence suggests that Iran just attacked the
Right.
water facilities
Yeah.
of my state. And the United States government response, personified by the president, was that probably my governor did it. It's fascinating to live in this time in which, like, we're told that we need to be more and more careful about more and more things. And then the attacks on, like, the most critical things feel like they're being taken less seriously. And the tools don't seem to be super helpful
Well, yeah.
in dealing with it.
Well, I mean,
it's a wild time.
Absolutely. And, like, I think when it comes to national security, there's a lot of discussion. And historically, there's always been a lot of discussion about, like, is national security zero sum? Like, if you put resources into protecting one thing over here, and that's a complicated question, and there's probably different answers depending on what you're talking about. But I will say, when it comes to this idea of the expansion of critical infrastructure, I mean, you make a great point. It's like, surely we cannot be creating new intelligence apparatuses, divisions, national security, counterintelligence for every element of our society. Now they're saying data centers are going to be critical infrastructure after Iran hit one in Saudi. They're saying the next thing it's going to be 7-Eleven is critical infrastructure because you're going to get stoned and you got to get in there and you got to get to Ben and Jerry's. Like, it
Picked
really,
a good example. I'm a huge
and
Slurpee fan.
Yeah, and that's critical. That's critical. So, I mean, it really does create this expansive net where then really what that means, critical infrastructure, is it means that the American people don't get a say in how those things are developed and utilized, right? I mean, it's really just putting this veil of secrecy onto everything, onto utilities, onto data centers, onto water infrastructure, and saying, like, you American people, piss off. You don't get a say in governance of this entire thing. And meanwhile, like you said, the government isn't actually protecting it. I mean, these things are porous. We live in a massive country with a lot of infrastructure. So, I think
I think
the American people crazy.
The American people aren't buying it. I mean, when I look at the reaction to the Amazon Ring commercial about saving the dog and people being horrified at the level of surveillance, I'm heartened and surprised. I wouldn't have predicted that reaction to that. People love finding lost dogs. We love dogs more than we like people, most of us. And we see people organizing, push their city councils to end or to not begin flock contracts. We see people taking matters into their own hands, sawing down the flock poles where they're out there, or putting trash bags on them, or disabling them in other ways. And so it does feel to me like this is not popular. What we hear over and over again is this is essential for public safety, but it doesn't feel like the public is buying that we need this level, that this is the right approach for public safety.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to conceptualize it is just, like, think about the sliding scale of security, right? Like, the most secure would be to have a sort of Gestapo state where everywhere we go, there are armed guards. And AI system that immediately records your face and withdraws money from your bank account for petty offenses, and then shoots a laser beam into your skull for capital offenses. And it's all fully automated, and we're as safe as we can be, and the laws are perfectly followed. It's like these arguments for the necessity of this increased security is obviously BS, and people describe it as just being a obvious increase in overall abstract security. But of course, we know that we are always making trade-offs between liberty and freedom and totalitarian quote unquote security. So it's clear, like you said, that this is a bipartisan issue that people hate. People understand that even law and order conservatives don't want to get docked if their odometer goes over, 2 miles over the speed limit. There is a acknowledgement, even with people who are very pro law enforcement, that this is a non-human system that doesn't actually meet the needs of people, and is rife, as we know from the reporting, with the potential for abuse. So, I mean, and look, I'll also just say the one other thing, which is that, like, again, going back to the pundits, the pundits say, like, well, okay, but they're going after Flock, and it's just going to get replaced with even bigger company, Axon, which is basically has the same product and has already been shown to be moving in. But these are armchair pundits, right? Who want to say, well, our democracy is messy. It's not going perfectly according to plan. It's not super neat. It's not perfectly organized. And therefore, this whole endeavor is stupid. And what, to me, that really fails to see is that, like, this is part of a movement where, for once, people have an outlet to react, not just to Flock safety cameras, but to the ubiquitous surveillance in all of our lives, whether that's AI facial recognition with meta glasses and your face getting uploaded and scanned, or whether that's surveillance pricing, whether that's the corporations knowing where your pain points are and watching everything you do so that they can extract the maximum amount of, Uber rides, or, they're talking even about doing, like, surveillance pricing in the grocery stores, where when you go to check out, you're paying different amounts of groceries compared to the person next to you based on your ad tech surveillance. So again, I think, like, this has to be viewed as a step of people finally seeing something that they can affect. And it doesn't end with Flock, right? It's not like, okay, we're just going to get rid of Flock and everything's going to be fine. I don't think anyone's saying that. I think if you talked to the people at the forefront of this movement, they would say this is not my only surveillance concern. But again, it's a way of practicing and also starting a national conversation about the amount of surveillance we want in our society. And newsflash, there's a lot of other Western European societies, countries that just do not have the same tolerance for surveillance. I'm calling in from Germany right now. You try to take a picture at a restaurant, of your table eating dinner or whatever, and the people behind you will get up and shield their face. Like they don't tolerate it.
You have the full range though, right? Because if you head over to London, then basically you can't take a step without, like, you're being 360 degrees recorded, is my impression.
Right. But they're trying to put one AI facial recognition camera at this one park with tons of open air drug use and all this stuff. And, like, this one camera, there's all over the city, there's graffiti, there's mass protests about this one camera. I mean, it's crazy. So yeah, I agree with you. I mean,
you're in Berlin, right? And so that's in Eastern Germany, although Berlin had a significant presence that was not a part of the Soviet Union. My understanding is that left a mark, right? When they saw what the Gestapo had done. Yes. I mean, you used that term earlier. It's literally comes from where you are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, I feel like
not only just the Nazi Gestapo, but then also the Stasi, right? After the war. I mean, there's 50 years basically of nonstop total surveillance.
And it left a major mark. And I hope we don't have the level of, I hope we get the mark and people have the aversion to it without having to go through that level of it. But I do feel like police using this technology, and let me say this to set this section off. I think the problem that set Flock aside, I think, is the national database. I think it is a different thing to have automated license plate readers. It is a different thing to have red light cameras and speeding cameras that take a photo, have evidence for a court of law for a proceeding, and then they send it and then they get rid of that information. They're not using it in a network effect. One of the things that set Flock aside, as I understand it, is that if you're in Memphis and you're trying to find a license plate, you could see if they drove through the Midwest, right? And so like there's this network effect and this big database, and it was not police officers using it to harass their exes, which is something that I feel like we see is that, like, you know, lots of we're somewhat familiar with that. In my mind, it was when ICE was using this database to fulfill the orders, which many of us believe are violating the Constitution, to harass certain people, and they suddenly have access to everyone's movements. That, I think, that's what I trace it to. But I could be wrong. I'm still a newbie relatively on Flock. So is there something to that, like the national database angle of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is a huge part of it. I think there's a degree to which like the feds can kind of get there on their own, right? Based on their ability to just tap into local state police to subpoena, you know, whoever they want. But yeah, I think that, and also like the fact that like it was all being centralized and it was being pitched to police, but then yeah, like it was being pitched to other federal law enforcement. It was also being pitched to like HOAs, right? Like private, like totally private communities. But yeah, I mean, the whole point of all of this is to create, you know, there's a term that DHS used a while ago in an article, like a total unified vision or something, right? Like it's really this idea of like total surveillance of everything all the time. And I mean, just like this America was founded on the idea that like our federal government is supposed to be responsive to the people. And you know, right now we have a wildly unpopular government that is doing things that people don't want. And, you know, it's just this type of immense power is out of control. And also just like, I think that a lot of times when we talk about surveillance, it becomes very abstract very quickly. And it becomes like, people fall back into talking about this idea of it like being creepy and being scary and it being abstract. But like, if you look at what the administration is doing right now with all of this surveillance power that everyone has been warning about for the past, you know, 30 or 40 years, you know, they really are using it to target and intimidate their political rivals. You know, they're using, as we saw in Minneapolis, like DHS is using these administrative subpoenas, right, to just, you know, they have the people, they have the research and intelligence on them, they have the surveillance, and, you know, it might not hold up in a court of law. You know, I think our courts actually are still pretty robust. But, you know, if you're targeted with a subpoena and they say, you know, we've got you on tape doing this, you know, driving to a peaceful meeting, whatever, you know, that you're not going to go to jail for that, but, you know, you're probably going to be pretty freaked out. And so I think like it's also important to talk about like what is the real world impact? I mean, the real world impact is like if you get shown your driving history from the feds, right? And they say that's going to change your behavior. And so
I think, I'll be very personal with this.
Yeah.
It's changed our behavior. I know that talking about this is gonna, you may have strong disagreements. I know members of the audience may have extreme disagreements. I don't have a gun in the home. I'm not I guess I would say I have very complicated feelings about firearms in the United States. The reason I don't have a gun in the home is because there's a far greater likelihood statistically, it's just math, that someone's much more likely to be significantly harmed. And being a white man, I'm far more likely to commit suicide with it than to use it in other ways. Like it's just really the statistics on guns. I feel like we don't talk enough about where the gun deaths come from. But like if you keep a gun out of the home, you really lower the chances of anything really bad happening. When the federal government was breaking into people's homes without warrants, without proper warrants, I guess I should say, my wife and I had a conversation about whether or not we should have a gun in the home, because my impression upon watching what was happening is if you have someone at your door about to break in from the federal government and you say, I've got a gun, it changes everything. And they are less likely to break your door down. And that's a conversation that 10 years ago, I never would have imagined having with my wife. Right? Like, you know, I mean, it's wild. And
but it reminds you why the Second Amendment is there. I mean, look, I agree with you. There's a lot of problems with our gun culture in America, but it does remind you about like, oh yeah, like our Constitution has stuff in there for a reason, right? And like, sure, like we're not muskets anymore. You know, we've got extended mag round clips, sure, but and same with surveillance, right? Same with right to privacy, same with freedom of speech and assembly, which are violated by mass surveillance. So sorry, you can keep going, but I'm just saying like,
no, and I think that's the thing that it just for me it comes down to is you get used to a level of normalcy with the government and forget how rapidly things can change. Now, this is a show that's about technology and community good, and so from my point of view, I think bringing that up is just to I think get a sense of when you allow certain technologies. And you have a national database. It is different when you give law enforcement, when you give federal agents more precisely the ability to track all this information by just logging in, as opposed to having to like subpoena or demand a database from a local police department. I mean, I remember it's 15 years ago. I was in Santa Monica when they did amazing work wiring the city with fiber for various public uses. And one of the things they did was they put in surveillance cameras in a variety of places, including structures that are parking garages for the city. And they had a procedure in which to tap into the live feed or to use it, you had to get the permission of the chief of police, and you had to, there was like it was logged. And I don't know, maybe there was abused from time to time. Like I do think it's not, these policies aren't magic. They're human beings. But there's a fundamental difference of having a local database that's small and having a national database where everything is super convenient, I think. And I don't know, it's a major distinction in my mind.
well, yeah, I mean, I do think that like there becomes an issue, which is something I'm working on, some reporting on, but which there's been some reporting on, which is like, that these companies can come in and like buy a municipality's data, even law enforcement data, and then they can jack it into their mainframe. I mean, like Nexus does this. I think TLO does this. I mean, it gets complicated. I mean, and then
Right.
and then
So
it
you're
gets to
telling me I'm wrong.
regulatory.
Like this, let's just be very clear here. Like
Yeah.
you're telling me that I'm foolish and I'm ignoring your specialty, which is that these databases, even if they're not publicly combined, there will be a tendency that private entities may well buy them, combine them,
Yeah.
or collect other information and then sell that to the federal government. And this is something I've talked to Sasha Meinrath about. There is no law that stops the federal government from buying information it is not allowed to collect.
No, and I talked to, I mean, shit, like 2 days ago, I was talking to like a very senior counterterrorism official, and most people on the inside, it's like, look, they've been on the inside. They're usually more gung ho than critical reporters or whatever. But like, you talk to a lot of people these days, and they're kind of like freaked out about what's going on. I mean, just the volume and specificity. I mean, you can really basically like do Prism with private data acquisition.
That was a federal program that collected data somewhat illegally.
Yeah. And I don't think I even fully sometimes acknowledge the scope of it. Like, I mean, I'm very interested in, there was a time recently in my life where I got close to being able to kind of peer into that orb of darkness, of Palantir of darkness, not Palantir specifically, but like really see some of that stuff granularly. And I kind of wish I had, because I don't know, like I've always said that I think the way to really jumpstart this conversation, I don't know if you have any billionaire listeners, but who could front my legal fees, but is really to kind of like do the maximalist data acquisition of like the Senate members on the House, on the Senate Intelligence Committee. I mean, I know that like Wired kind of did this like a couple of years ago where they bought a bunch of commercially available data on people, but like they kind of didn't go all the way. They kind of were like, you can do this, but they didn't actually like name names and like actually create an international crisis. And so I think, I think that would really show the level of granularity of like, I'm sure you could find politicians petty records, petty misdemeanor stuff in a local record that then got hoovered up into one of the big national databases and repackaged. And, God knows what kinds of stuff in their browser history got pinged, right? And then creates an ad profile that shows that, maybe their sexual orientation is different than the one that they've told, whatever. Like, my point is that, we just have no regulation, and people are pretty unaware of that. And I think it's different though than your question of like, is it wrong? Like that to me is like, that's a whole other can of worms of like, yeah, maybe, I don't know, sure. Like you got a small municipality and like you have a speed camera that's clocking people doing 20 over, and you have regulations that are really harsh for selling or manipulating that data. And there's harsh penalties if anyone, maybe then we're talking about it. But to me, like we don't, as you said, unlike Germany, unlike Berlin, that's had 50 years of hyper surveillance, we don't really have necessarily that same privacy culture necessarily, or at least we haven't adapted to the data age in America.
No, I think that's right. And the thing that Flock is betting on, and I think this conversation, I think we've established the concerns, and I would say that my concerns and the dramatic stories that we see coming out of Minnesota with the federal government violating the Constitution on multiple fronts and bringing us back to the COINTELPRO age and illegally surveilling people. That's one thing. If Barack Obama was still president and we just had the level of government abuse, of unconstitutional like telecommunications searches and things like that, it would still be concerning. And I think that's what Flock, Garrett Langley was on ABC 7 in Los Angeles on July 23rd. And I just noted that, a couple of quotes from that. But like, he's trying to return to that age, I feel like, which is like, it's sort of like a level of concern that doesn't hit the limits of the overreach, I think. And I say that just, to be very clear, like, I am uncomfortable with Democrats going a little bit over the line, and I'm deeply uncomfortable with Donald Trump going way over the line of like what is permissible. But the thing that Flock and others are betting on is that safety is going to rule the day, that people are deeply concerned. He said in an interview there's two things I wanted to get at. One is we see that building confidence in a community, that they're going to be safe, that their kids can go out and play, that you can start a business, is critical to thriving communities. And that's why Flock is important. He feels like that message, that's what is going to like get Flock back on top, I think. This idea that, and I mean, I guess I want to set this off against like I love the Daredevil series, like the Defenders of Hell's Kitchen and Harlem and all the different areas of New York that come together. But like, it leaves a terrible taste in my mouth to watch this show set in the modern era with crime out of control. Crime is not out of control. We live in possibly the safest time that numbers of humans have gathered in the numbers and space that we have. We have almost no murders historically by like from thousands of years of human history of living together. But like there's this idea that like we are not safe and we need this technology to be safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think part of that, I mean, I've read different things about this. It's obviously like a perennial issue for pundits. And I think there's different answers that combine for why people have this obsession and why that CEO thought it was a good idea to address that. I mean, look, I think that going back to my original point about the sort of total surveillance with armed guards and Gestapo and laser beams, whatever, like, I think we have to acknowledge that, like, if you build a panopticon, you do create more security, right? Like, if everyone is being surveilled and thrown in prison, like, I think it's fair to say that crime will go down. And in fact, I think that there have been some municipalities, I think like there was an article about Jersey, I think, for example, where there was some crime rate. And like basically the way they did it was by like incarcerating a shit ton of people using like AI security cameras. So there is an argument there.
It's not just an argument. It's like, I mean, I spent 4 months in the Middle East in the year 2000. I was in Israel. I was in what is today called Palestine. It was West Bank and Gaza. I was in Jordan. And then I went to Lebanon. And there's very low street crime in most of those areas, especially in Tel Aviv, because there was a guy with an M16, or there was a person, a lot of times there was women, with an M16 on every street corner. Now, there is a ton of domestic abuse. There's a ton of rape, but like there is no street crime. And so I think it's important to understand when we're talking about public safety, what we're talking about. And you get that, but I want to make sure listeners hear it.
Yeah, but that gets to our point, right? And that gets to like what a lot of the reporting I've done too, which is that it becomes a hyperfixation with certain types of violent crime at the expense of, just truly looking at any of the other factors that are degrading quality of life. And so, like, one thing I've tried to report on a lot is how, for the first time, really, like what we're seeing inside of the domestic intelligence agencies around this Flock stuff and around the AI data center protests is like this huge new threat category that is so big that like, to me, it feels unprecedented, because at least like when you go back and you look at things like, okay, there was mass surveillance, Hoover era surveillance of the civil rights movement. Like, okay, that's maybe like the biggest, or the left, or the Red Scare. Like that's really big, but also it's like still, even those things are still like relatively confined to like African Americans and their allies, or to labor unions and really vocal left-wing groups. Like this, the so-called threat categories that I've been reporting on from internal documents are anti-technology extremism, which is like literally there's no person who hasn't gotten pissed off at some horrible nightmare technology at some point and written a Facebook post about like how annoying it is, or that they're can't get the right iPhone charger because, it's a different model. And so to me, there's a really fascinating expansion. And at the same time, that that all these people are being grouped under this new anti-technology extremism threat category, which I've reported on extensively. All these other issues are being completely ignored. And, the only way that the federal law enforcement apparatus and intelligence agencies can conceive of addressing this, right, is by increasing surveillance, increasing the dragnet, trying to minimize threat actors, blah, 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 blah. And they're not looking at any of the underlying reasons why people are upset about this. And it becomes this paranoid hunt to increase surveillance and catch them and do pre-crime, prevent the next person from committing that act, instead of saying, okay, let's take a holistic approach here. Let's turn the anxiety down here, and let's, figure out how to actually address these concerns, or work with municipalities and even maybe the corporations. I mean, as much as that idea is revolting to me, it's also like, if these law enforcement agencies were really serious, wouldn't they be incentivizing these companies and these municipalities to turn the temperature down and to create alternatives? But instead, all they can do is look for the next threat, look for the next attack, and maybe they're gonna pick off some lunatic on Twitter saying he's gonna blow up a data center. But, is that really gonna solve the problem long term? I don't know. I don't think so. And as we know, historically, these things don't catch everyone, and they never will. And they're not effective systems for that.
I pay attention to some of the stuff that the FBI has done, among others, among leftist movements that are sometimes, often don't, but sometimes do feature violent rhetoric about blowing up data centers, for instance. And what it seems to me you find is that, like, I think you'd probably be honest to say 9 times out of 10 or 19 times out of 20, the person that is talking about blowing up the data center would never have a means to do it, absent the FBI showing up with an informant and saying, here are the explosives. Right. And then they lock that person in jail. And that person probably needs anger management more than like jail, because they were never going to actually do it. Now, there are some people that may try to do it. There are people that do horrific things like that, and they need to be stopped. But I think you're right. They get hyper fixated on it. The law enforcement does. I think often because they're not good at their jobs. The leadership in particular. I don't know. I don't want to get into a whole thing about my theories about who rises up to leadership and these sorts of things. But like, I will say that like we had an interesting test case here in Minnesota. ShotSpotter is a technology that's kind of like Flock. I feel like it's like the people that are organizing around Flock. A lot of them, the ones that have been organizing on this for years, were organized around ShotSpotter before. It's a technology that supposedly allows you to find gunshots, and the theory being If you can find the gunshot, then you can try and get guns off the streets. You can try and intervene earlier and things like that. The technology is expensive and arguably doesn't work all that well. So in Minneapolis, you have ShotSpotter, and in St. Paul, there was this discussion about whether or not the city of St. Paul should do this. My mayor, his dad had been a cop, and he basically wasn't sold on ShotSpotter. Had disagreements with the police on it, and they came to a really good thing. This is like a perfect case of like politics working, I think. They decided to try a different strategy. They put a bunch of money into public safety to resolve homicides. We were having some issues with homicides. They were not high historically, but unacceptably high for the community. And to, I don't know, I'm just rambling on, but like the point of this is that they embraced the strategy of trying to solve the non-fatal shots, gunfire. And they ended up with St. Paul's had a clearance rate of homicides for like 100% for a while. They do a really good job of that. And they decided to really focus on the attempted homicides, which are difficult cases. A lot of times, if you get shot at, you're probably someone who's engaged in something that you don't want to talk to the police about. I mean, that's just sort of where this crime happens often. And so, but they did it, and they got the clearance rate for those up to 70%. And we went like half of the year without a homicide the following year. And Minneapolis did not embrace that strategy. There's complicating factors if you dig into any of this, but like what we saw is that if you engaged in real policing and built trust in the community, you had far better results than if you just throw money at some surveillance company that promises to solve all your issues with some magic.
Yeah, and it's like I want places to be safe. Like I don't like crime. I do think that there are people on the left who like have such an ideological commitment and they hate police so much, and they hate the state of our horrible prisons so much that like it does become this complete ideological abstraction. And like I don't feel that way. I don't like crime. I don't think crime is good. But at the same time, what I think is also not good is, like you said, strategies that don't work, that just give the federal government more control over our lives. And, that's why I've been really focusing on fusion centers. These are these sort of like recombinators that cycle intelligence and surveillance between state and local police and DHS and FBI. And actually sometimes also the CIA, as I've come to learn, in very rare instances. And if you talk to serious people inside of FBI or DHS, what they'll tell you is that like the intelligence that these places are generating is total garbage, and it's not serious, and it doesn't really ever work. And a lot of it is, one guy said state troopers try and play, Jason Bourne, where, they like the shit you get in these reports. Like I published one on my Substack that was about like teenagers like pretending to pee on their like high schools and then uploading the shit to the internet. And it was like, why is that an intelligence product? Why is a state trooper writing up a report about a fake urination online and then sending that to the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security? Why does that exist? And so it's just this logic of paranoia and fear. And, it's like, what if that guy went and like hung out in that high school and like found some kids who weren't doing so hot and could use a mentor? It's like it's just this logic of paranoia that then feeds on itself and generates these insane intelligence products, and then can give the feds under an administration like this the ability to go and nail people, or exactly like what you said. I mean, look, the reality is that you get promoted in the bureau by making cases, right? And I mean, I've talked to senior FBI executives who, are really intelligent in some ways, and then in other ways are like, how are we going to prevent crime if we don't set people up in stings that they would never have had access to before? To them, that really is a legitimate way of kind of like culling the herd of crazies, basically. And their opinion is really like, even if this person could have never had access to weapons, like we're kind of lowering this abstraction, this abstract threat level that we've all convinced ourselves of. And so, whether it's the flock camera going into its own national database, or whether it's local intelligence being fused in these centers and shot up the chain of command, it's like, does it work? And I think the answer is usually it doesn't, and usually what it does is it gives the feds the ability to mess with people like labor unions and activist orgs that are engaging in constitutionally protected speech and organizing. And that's really the ultimate fear. And even if those people don't go to jail, that like when you see the New York Times article about the feds surveilling your labor union, and maybe you've got an undocumented parent, or maybe you've got a friend who's an addict and is out and is clean, but you're worried that now they're linked to you and they're going to be under more scrutiny. Like there's a lot of ways that these intelligence agencies and law enforcement officials like to say, well, if you're not committing a crime, then this isn't going to affect you. And it's just simply not true.
Well, and I think there's an issue of national security as well, where I would agree with some of the hawks in terms of when China is able to hack our databases so easily, and then they're looking for some way to blackmail people. We've made it super easy.
And they have hacked it. I'm pretty sure they're still in our network. I mean, Salt Typhoon was this massive breach, and they were in there for like months. And then even after we realized they were in our system, we couldn't they were in all of our telecoms.
Yeah, because so much of this is theater. I mean, Bruce Schneier, I think, popularized the idea of security theater in airports and things like that. And so much of this is theater, but people are reacting to it. So let's get back to something. I mean, you started off noting that it's exciting to see people exercising the democratic will. A lot of them are being told, you're stupid. Don't, like you're wrong about this stuff. I think I have a negative tendency. I've really been trying to check it for years of like telling people, oh, you don't understand it enough or something. Like I've encouraged people to do more, but like, people need to like act on their beliefs in an open society. And this is wonderful. I mean, I'm less encouraging of people that strongly believe we need to ban books getting together and organizing for political power. But like for people who are like organizing against surveillance, like what are the things they should focus on? Is Flock the right thing? Is it trying to make sure the federal government cannot buy, is it changing culture? I mean, like how do we engage in like sort of the, what was the group that did the culture jamming back like 20-30 years ago? They did the billboards and they're focused on like media and stuff.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but like it's like that's a real thing to like focus on changing the culture so people value privacy more.
Yeah, but I would say that this goes beyond changing the culture. I mean, what you're doing is you're showing like when I think of like city government, I grew up in the suburbs outside of Boston, okay? And when I think about what city government in suburbia looked like, it was some assholes fighting with each other about, whose drive, can you extend the driveway, and are you going to put up shrubs or hedges? And, it's like these little petty fights. And I think what this shows is that like you can take any fight to your local government, and you can go up against a multinational corporation. You can go up against Meta. You can go up against one of these data center firms, and you can win at a local level with your community, with left and right teaming up, to stop this stuff. And so I say do it all. Whether it's Flock, whether it's data centers. I mean, my new evangelical next push is going to be the elimination of memorandums of understanding with the FBI, right? Through the FBI's joint terrorism task forces, which exist, all over the country, they're basically able to go and plug jack into local and state police. They're able to basically deputize local and state police into the FBI. And we know that, these JTTFs, these Joint Terrorism Task Forces, are being used really as like one of the central fulcrums for NSPM-7, which is this national directive criminalizing all kinds of dissent, in very large, ambiguous terms. It criminalizes anti-Americanism. It criminalizes anti-traditional family values, whatever the hell that means. And most cities have a memorandum of understanding, and a number of them over the years have terminated that MOU and basically kicked the FBI out of their local government. And so I think that's another great way that's something that people should get excited about, and that I've been evangelizing about. But the point is that like we don't have to sit and take it. And the point of America is that it's a huge country, and that people can choose what they want to do. If they want to have extended mag clips and endless school shootings, so that they can go to the gun range and blow stuff up with saw machine guns, they can do that in some states, and if they think that, whatever, children, women don't have rights to their body and all this crazy crap, okay, fine. Then go lobby and do your state government and build your own weird little bizarro place. That's America. But it also means that if you don't want a data center destroying your pristine environment and neighborhood, you can organize and stop that. And, I just think people have really forgotten. They've been demoralized. They've been ground down. I think, you look at what's happening in national politics right now. People are voting for whoever is shaking things up the most. That's why I think they voted for Trump in the first place. But the reality is that people are also waking up to the fact that they have a tremendous amount of power at the local level. And again, I mean, it's one thing with Flock, but I think there's more national hatred towards understanding the hatred towards Flock. Certainly with the data centers, I've been seeing both left and right commentators really taking up this high horse thing of, they don't actually use this much water, and, we need this to be competitive with China, and, blah, 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 blah. And, I say, great, keep on that stuff. And, today it's data centers, and, tomorrow it's nuclear weapons facilities. This is a unprecedented in my lifetime strengthening of local civic politics, and I think it does not stop with any one of these issues. And it's awesome. It's great.
I mean,
Beautiful.
I will say that I just visited a new data center built in an Indian country on a reservation, and the term data center doesn't really do service. This is so that they can serve everyone with a fiber optic network locally. It uses no water. It's built in a very responsible way, and it's the hyperscaler and in like these massive out of scale data centers. I feel like no one would even know this data center was there if they didn't advertise it, basically, because it's like it just fits into everything. So I will just say that I'm concerned with some people passing overly, and we're going to talk about this in a future show, not, I think, having a proper definition of which data centers to be concerned about.
Sure,
so
totally.
I am one of those people that says it's complicated.
No, that's fair. And it is complicated. I'm not saying it's not complicated. I'm not saying it's black and white. And in fact, there's something perverse to me a little bit when you see these politicians kind of jumping on the bandwagon, where it's kind of like, hold on a second, you're a national politician. You're just saying this shit. You don't even have any data centers in your state or whatever. So I agree. But the point is that, like, you can't let that impulse necessarily, to me, look, data centers are different than vaccines, right? Like, it's one thing to say, well, look, these effects are maybe overstated, and there's some kind of woo-woo takes about the energy fields around these things. But, look, people still have the right to determine if they want it or not. Whereas, something like vaccines, to me, that's kind of like, okay, well, like, this is more hard science, and this is going to have a horrible rippling effect. And
well, I mean, public health has this, if you dig into it, a lot of people aren't familiar with this, but like there's millennia of how humans have had to deal with public health because it doesn't impact ourselves. This is not the whole, like, it's my body thing. It's actually like we put other people at risk based on different actions. So yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. Like, there's different ways to respond to these different things. And I also further agree with your sentiment. I mean, it was phrased in very direct terms in terms of your feelings about guns and abortion issues. But like, I do think that on the number of issues, we need to have a variance among the states and people's political power. We should take it seriously, and we shouldn't seek to resolve everything from Washington, D.C. It's a mistake, I think, to resolve everything from there. But when it comes down to the national surveillance, we have to be concerned. And I mean, I'll just wrap up the show by noting that I do feel like this technology is different. And it is different to have like video cameras that are analog and used by police and perhaps even abused by police, to having everything digitized and able to be searched and combined by commercial entities is like, I always forget about this, but you reminded us of it, into these different databases, and then to be available for the federal government to get information they shouldn't otherwise be able to get, to have private companies able to get this together for their surveillance pricing. There's all kinds of implications. And I feel like I'm the kind of person that I'm like, hey, how do we deal with this in the past? And there's times where that doesn't serve you. There's times where we have to have new policies and new ways to deal with things.
Yeah.
I think we're coming up on that.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's what's confusing to people, where I think the policy wonks, again, are really like, wait a second, like this isn't going to be the perfect solution. It's like, well, again, we are developing something new. Something new is burgeoning. And again, it's not being directed by DC or national politician. And that means, it's going live. It's mutating in the petri dish, and that's what democracy is. So
Yes.
yeah.
Well, this is, we call the show Unbuffered, and I feel like we didn't hold anything back on this one. So
I try not to.
It's great to meet you. I really, I hope you have a lot of luck with the work you're doing, and I look forward to following you. What's the name of your Substack?
Oh yeah, my Substack is called Deeper States.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Daniel.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Unbuffered podcast. We have transcripts for this and other episodes available at ilsr.org/podcast. While you're there, check out our other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. Email us at podcast@communitynets.org with your ideas for the show. Follow us on Blue Sky. Our handle is @CommunityNets. You can catch the latest research from all of our initiatives by subscribing to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount helps keeps us going. Unbuffered is produced by Christopher Mitchell with editing provided by me, Jordan Pittman. Until next time, thanks for listening.